Welcome back to Books and Authors. My guest is Deb Welch, and the book is Payback, a Nate Dunleavy novel. And Deb, let's chat a little bit about one of the other central figures in the book, and that's a new character, actually.
Yes.
And that's Fadia.
Right.
And we encounter her in Madrid first, and then throughout the story. Describe her.
Fadia is a young woman with a Muslim background who basically has had her life threatened because she was, after a tragic incident where her father was killed during the Akari assassination, her uncle, who's an Islamic fundamentalist, interjected himself into the lives of her family and tried to force her into a marriage that was just not something that she could live with. It was with a man who was probably old enough to be her grandfather. He basically is an Al-Qaeda kingpin who becomes Nate's main nemesis in this book. But anyway, she basically is running from an imposed marriage and also the threat of being actually murdered for dishonoring her family. And that's kind of bringing out some of the issues that I read about and I struggle with as far as the rights of women in these extreme Islamic cultures. We see women who are forced into marriage. We see women who are threatened with honor killing even though they might have been raped, and it's the male relatives who are trying to end their lives because of the disgrace supposedly brought onto their family. Recently, a female journalist had some ad run that she wasn't even responsible for directly, but because she had some role at this news station, she had to go through 60 lashes. I mean, this is the way they punish this woman.
Yes, and as we were chatting off camera, it's ironic timing. I was just listening to NPR recently, and there was a story about, I believe it was in Yemen, about how these very young girls were forced into these marriages.
Yes.
But it seems to be condoned in Sharia law, or at least extreme law, especially with the Taliban, from what I understand. Do you see any of this ever changing? I mean, I applaud you for making note of it, but is it something that no matter what we do overseas, it's something that will always be there?
Well, you cannot force a culture to change. The one thing we can do is raise awareness so that people understand it's happening, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change the people who practice that particular religion or that custom. The one thing that you would hope is that more and more women are being educated, and you know, the change has to occur from within the group that's actually being repressed. The women have to, I guess, be in a position where they have enough strength in numbers that eventually they can affect the change in this law within their own country and make it go away.
If anything, that may make our campaigns a little more noble at this point in time. You've done a lot of work, obviously, with reading about the Islam and Muslim people, and you've incorporated a couple of key characters. There's one in particular, and I know I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but he is the nemesis, and that is Wahid al-Hijazi.
Yeah, Wahid al-Hijazi.
Yes. And how did you come up with this guy? And is he based on anybody in particular?
Well, no. I mean, he's an amalgamation of Osama bin Laden and some of the other kingpins that we're trying to try in New York City or take to a court-martial in military courts. I mean, he's just somebody who's ruthless. He has a son who he has raised to hate the Western civilization. His son has been educated. The son is the one who's supposed to go out and mastermind these attacks on crowded stadiums through his engineering education. But of course, the son would never become the suicide bomber. We'll make sure that we have somebody else's sons that are going to actually sacrifice their lives and become the martyrs that create this problem. And of course, the catalyst to the book is the fact that his son is killed by, I won't say who, but somebody during that Madrid mission.
Yes, exactly. One thing that Nate refers to, and you touched on it earlier, about rules of engagement.
Right.
And tell us about what you mean in this and what Nate is talking about with the rules of engagement.
Okay. Well, I think anybody who follows the news knows that all of the troops that we've had in Iraq and the ones that we have in Afghanistan have very strict rules that they must follow before they use any kind of force when they feel, when someone engages them, that they in an uncertain situation. Whether that force be lethal or otherwise, they have a very thick rule book, whether or not they can even raise their weapon, whether they can point it, whether they can fire it. And I think about these people who are dealing with roadside bombs, people coming out of a crowd, whether it be a woman in a burqa or even a child that could possibly be carrying a bomb, and these people have to go through these rules of engagement and make snap decisions whether or not they can use any kind of force to protect their lives.
Would you rather see the rules relaxed a bit?
I am not a military expert. I understand that they're in a tough position over there because you don't know who the enemy is. You don't know whether the civilian coming out of the market is the enemy, and I know that you can't go over there and just, freely fire into a crowd.
Especially with the way the news is today, it will be broadcast instantly.
Right.
So it's not like let's say the Second World War or even Vietnam for that matter. So yes, it's a tough call.
Right.
One thing I also want to touch on is the fact that this is written as an action thriller, and if I didn't know who was writing this, I would never assume it was a female, because you get both genders spot on. As a male reading this, I mean, from every scene, and it's fascinating. And the question is, how do you do this? What was the research, or do you have an inside track? I mean, it's really remarkable.
Well, the research, obviously, I read my share of books written by male authors as well as female authors. But I guess since I was in my early 20s, I was in a career dealing very much in a man's environment, working my way up through management positions where the majority of people I had to deal with on a day-to-day basis were men. And you have to think like a man, even though you can still act like a woman. You have to think like a man to be able to relate to them and get your points across, be taken seriously. That's the way it was when I was coming up in my career in the late 70s, early 80s.
You've been able to extrapolate that into the story.
Perhaps, yeah.
Very interesting.
I've been married for over 30 years. Any
I'm sure that helps.
woman who's been married to a fairly strong, alpha-oriented male learns a lot about the male viewpoint, whether you want to or not.
Now, it is a fairly serious novel, but you've got some really delicious humor in there.
Well, thank you. You have to break up some of that
so there's
intensity.
a couple interesting scenes. And did you have ideas about some of these when you went? I mean, I'm speaking specifically, there's a scene in the White House.
Oh, yeah, that's with Devin and Katie.
Yes.
That's the comic relief duo there.
Is that something that you heard may have actually happened, or is it maybe?
Well, obviously, if you follow presidents throughout the years, all kinds of shenanigans could go on in the White House. And this is before the current administration, and I was saying, well, let's just go ahead and write it and give people a little bit of a laugh. But then since I heard about the two gate crashers there, Michelle and Tariq,
it becomes a little more realistic.
Anything can happen, right?
I understand.
The one thing I wonder about that is how many poor Secret Service agents might have lost their careers or been reassigned to
Someday we'll
Podunk
see that
USA.
expose, I guess, of their stories.
Yeah.
Now, there is some parallel with the Academy Award-winning movie Hurt Locker in some ways, and I think most readers will pick that up. Tell us about that, and was that something that just happened to happen, or was that something that you actually saw coming?
Well, you're referring to a scene in Washington, D.C. where there are multiple car bombs, and basically it's kind of a retaliation for the thwarted attempt on the European soccer stadiums, whereby they know that the U.S. must have been involved in that. And there are multiple car bombs parked along Embassy Row. I had read an article a couple of years ago, and it dealt with the subway bombing in London, where there were multiple threats. And I guess the article questioned whether or not in Washington we could react effectively if we had multiple bomb threats. And there was a dilemma because the actual city of Washington might not have all the resources it needs, but they were relying on people coming from Quantico and other local, both government and military installations that are all in that area. The problem is if anybody's been in Washington, D.C., anything that goes on there causes absolute gridlock in that city. I mean, up and down I-95, around the Beltway.
Just unbelievable.
And we have a situation where they're trying to divert traffic around the city because you've got 4 or 5 car bombs that are threatening it.
It's a wild scene.
You can't get these resources there.
No. Now, another thing, in the brief time you have left, I kind of also see a little bit of 24 in some ways with Nate. I mean, he kind of reminded in some ways of Jack Bauer. Do you see Nate as a guy that might be looked at as sort of a hero, maybe the reluctant hero in some ways?
Well, I hope so. I mean, he's certainly the protagonist, and he's the all-American guy out there fighting to keep us safe and taking care of his women and his family, and of course the fact he tries to take too good a care if he causes some of the conflict between them because she pushes back.
Which is good. Which is something the readers have to pick up on, and I hope they do.
Yeah, we have some good interplay between those two, and a lot of the male, female, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, but still a very, very strong woman who's not going to get to sit back and,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Deb, it's been a pleasure.
Okay.
And we're so glad that you came by
Well, thank you.
to show the book to us. And again, the book is Payback, if you can see it up here, and it's a wonderful story. And it picks up from where Flashback left off, and it'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, I just finished it, and it was wonderful. For Books and Authors, I'm Chris O'Donnell. Good night.